Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the MedTech Impact Podcast, where you get to hear from leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of medical technology. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Mickelsen.
And we're your hosts of the show.
So today on the MedTech Impact Podcast, we're delighted to be joined by Stephen Mickelsen, CEO and founder of Field Medical. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Richard. Hey, Kyle.
What's going on?
This is totally awesome because, we were just talking offline about your history in this industry, and particularly when it comes to pulse field ablation. I mean, I've heard the University of Iowa are campaigning for the new version of Mount Rushmore for the founding father of pulse field ablation. So, you're going to have your head chiseled in granite because really, again, you are one of these history makers when it comes to this technology. As always, when we start these conversations, we do like to set the stage for the listeners. So can you tell us a little bit about the big problem that Field Medical is trying to solve?
Well, Field Medical, so my background as a cardiac electrophysiologist, I still practice actually, maybe 2 days a month, 4 days a month. But my biggest focus is on developing new technology that's going to help the patients that I see and help my fellow electrophysiologists improve the field, our ability to reach more patients successfully and with a lot more safety and workflow efficiency. I like that stuff, and it's been a part of my career for the last more than a decade for sure. The problem that I'm trying to solve right now is ventricular arrhythmias. It sounds if you're not really familiar with the heart and how it works, if your heart goes too fast, it's not a very efficient pump. And in fact, if it goes so fast that it can't pump blood effectively, you can die from that. It's called ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. We know it as sudden cardiac death. These are big problems that require an enormous amount of hospital resources to try to address and fix, and can be life-changing for people. With pulse field ablation, when I started working on atrial fibrillation, I was really looking for a way to make it more efficient procedure-wise, but also a lot safer. AFib is a nuisance problem, and it's a huge problem. It's definitely become the most important segment of the cardiac arrhythmia treatment market, for procedural, for catheter ablation at least. And so that ended up being a transformative solution. But the ventricle itself is what the field is focused on, because there just hasn't been a lot of work in that area, and a lot of dedicated development of new technology to address these problems. And we can talk all day long about that, but but that's our focus: a giant unmet need, a recognized unmet need, and a place where I think the knowledge that I've gained over years and years of working with pulse field could be transformative in this space.
Yeah, and again, it's so fascinating because you, as an MD, as a surgeon, have this unbelievable insight into the procedure, into actually what the patient's going through. Maybe you could delve a little bit deeper in terms of some of the complexity around VT, and what makes it so different from traditional AFib.
Yeah, so I don't know how much of the audience will know this, but boy, when a cardiac doctor who does cardiac arrhythmia catheter ablation, what we do is we take a lot of sophisticated machinery, minimally invasively, go through the vessels, get catheters up in the heart, and we make measurements of the activation of the heart. And we figure out, based on really fancy equipment and using the tools that we have at our disposal, we can figure out exactly where the abnormal tissue is in the heart. And then we put a catheter on top of that spot, and we destroy the abnormal tissue, and we try to preserve all the good tissue. And that's called catheter ablation. In the atria is pretty thin, so you can get to almost any target you can find, and you can ablate there, and you will be able to reach it because it's anywhere from 1 millimeter to 5 millimeters thick. And the atria doesn't move as very much. A lot of it's kind of tethered down. It's a capacitance organ in many ways. The blood flows in there and then it contracts, but the walls don't change position very much. So it's pretty stable overall to work in. And geometrically, moving catheters through the vessels to get into the first chambers of the heart is pretty straightforward as well. And so the challenges that we have to overcome for making tools that work well there, have been overcome. From the 1980s on, we've really optimized our ability to get tools to the spot and figure out where the problems are and ablate there. The ventricle is very different. The ventricle is incredibly thick. It's over a centimeter thick, and most people, when you take it, has very complex structure. So it has these deep fingers of tissue and ruts. We call them, trabeculi. And it's moving a lot. It's moving every time you have a cardiac beat. It's moving centimeters. And so it's hard to get a stable catheter. It's working in that environment. And once you get to the spot, if you can be stable there and you try to create a lesion, because of the way radio frequency works and heat transfer works, it can be very hard to make a good lesion that reaches what you need to reach. And so I think that has been a huge disincentive. When we work in the ventricle, we, as doctors, there's a lot of doctors who specialize in that, and it can be very rewarding because if you can reach the spot, you can actually potentially cure the patient of that one problem. And that can be transformative and life-saving for people. And so there's a lot of incentive to do it, but it's really hard to do with the current toolkit we have.
Well,
Yeah, and that's
please.
such a nice explanation. So I just wanted to quickly say, like, in terms of like summarizing that, I know you said it's complex, but
Yes.
you've obviously explained this to patients on numerous occasions, and I think that was a really neat summary. And yeah, I think just learning how you've gone from Kyle, like MD to entrepreneur. Now, obviously, we're going to discuss a little bit more about this innovation.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks.
No,
Yeah,
it's
hopefully that was clear enough. There are challenges but they're geometric challenges, they're mechanical challenges, and then the last one is this energy. Like, have we chosen the right energy source to be able to address the problem? Once you identify where it is, and once you get your tool to the spot, now you have to ablate it. What's the best way to do that? And that's what field medical is focused on: pulse field ablation, or electroporation, or as they called it in the late 1800s, fulguration. It's been around a while, but people haven't really learned how to optimize it for medical therapy until very recently. And I think that's what's been so transformative about FARAPULSE, and the paradigm shifts that have occurred because of that, because it's not a new energy source. It's just one that we didn't know how to apply properly. And now I think we do. And so that energy source allows us to reach very deep. So if I want a fully transmural lesion, I know how to do that with pulse field. If I need to reach complex structures that I can't have stability with, I need to be able to deliver the energy, while the heart is basically in a standstill between each contraction, because pulse field is delivered in, microseconds or milliseconds. It's not delivered over minutes. And, and so because of that, when the energy is delivered, the catheter has complete stability. Yeah. And so it's really wonderful that way. So, and it's a proximity ablation. And so that if the arrhythmia is due to pathways that are through these complex pieces of muscle called trabeculi, you can ablate them without having to have the catheter right on top of it. It can just be next to it. And so, there's huge advantages here that I see worth, exploring, and, hence, investing and building a company on it.
Stephen, I want to take it back too to when you first started Iowa Approach. You were and still are a practicing cardiologist. What was it that kind of inspired you to get into the medical device development side of the business?
Yeah, well, that's what inspired me to go to medical school in the first place, was the medical device side of the business. I was a technician in a cath lab, working with Fred Kuzumoto in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I was kind of his lead tech. And he and I were, he was a mentor to me, taught me everything. I started publishing papers with him. And in those days, you could just have on-the-job training. You didn't need any formal training to be a tech. Doctors just pick anyone off the road and say, "Hey, you're my tech." And that's good, because I was a high school dropout. I didn't have any formal training. And and because of that experience, what made me excited about it is I joined the field of electrophysiology in the early 90s when radio frequency was brand new and they were developing all these new tools. And so we'd sit around and talk about, inventing stuff. And I got excited about that part of it. But I realized that I would have to be an electrophysiologist if people were going to take me seriously, or at least go to school. So I decided to go to college to become an electrophysiologist. And I started working on new inventions for solving problems, cardiac autonomics, and new types of pacemakers, new techniques for getting around the heart. And, I did a lot of stuff until I joined at the University of Iowa as a fellow. And I invented 4 or 5 things and put in these disclosures to the university. The one that they liked was the one that had the ablation for AFib. And AFib, it was such a big problem. I actually saw Pierre Pierre Geiss and Hosseguer give their presentation at what was called NASPE at the time, North American Society of Pacing and Electrophysiology. They gave their seminal talk on, guess what? Now we can address AFib because everyone thought that wasn't something you could target with ablation. And they showed that you could. And that really started the whole move towards building new technology. And I realized in 2005 that, the complication rates were quite high. And then by 2008 or something, there was this whole thing about asymptomatic cerebral emboli. And it just occurred to me, it just wasn't responsible for me to be a doctor and continue down this path of doing these procedures unless we were really working on making them safer. I mean, when you're talking about treating millions of people with a nuisance problem, you don't want to put them at risk. And so PFA, when I looked at every energy source out there, I looked at diphtheria toxin, I looked at alcohol, looked at lasers, ultrasound, radiation, and I looked at the pros and cons of every energy source or every way of ablating. And what came to the top by far was good old fashioned DC ablation. It had so many of the advantages I was looking for. And I just thought to myself, why on earth did we give up on this? Because that's how catheter ablation started. So the very first catheter ablation ever done in 1980 by Mel Scheinman at the University of San Francisco was done with a defibrillator and an old quadrupole catheter that they stuck next to the AV node, and they fired it off. And sure enough, it worked. Prior to that, you needed open heart surgery.
It's incredible. I mean, it's funny, Richard, too, because we've actually had another guest on the show, and forgive me because he escapes my name, but it's just really interesting how oftentimes there's been some sort of big milestone, something that's happened, something that was invented decades ago, maybe even 100 years ago, that people just kind of dismissed. Right. So good on you, Stephen, for identifying that and kind of bringing it back and realizing, whoa, hey, this actually is the most effective way, or what you believe is the most effective way to treat these patients. So it's really cool. So then obviously Iowa approach, I mean, a lot of people in the industry at least know this already, but that turned into FARAPULSE. And now you've seen FARAPULSE grow into an amazing technology that's been acquired by Boston Scientific. Just absolutely remarkable. And it is the flagship product for treating atrial fibrillation for Boston Scientific. So now here you are starting Fields Medical. And when I think about the technology and the products and the tools that you're bringing to market, I'm just super curious, what is the strategy? How is it different? How is it unique? And how is it solving, the problem here in VT treatments?
Well, it's something I learned from Alan Zingler, who is the guy I hired to replace me at what would become FARAPULSE. The funny thing about Iowa Approach was we only called it Iowa Approach because I had to raise money in Iowa. And so when we moved the company to California, the key there was, they renamed it with something that made more sense. So, it's marketing. But what is field doing is, so the electric field was what inspired me. We did reverse engineering. I recognize that the most versatile tool that a doctor who practices catheter ablation uses is a focal deflectable catheter. Because it's small, you can put it through a small hole to get it in the vein. That's safer. everyone knows how to use one, whether you're doing pulmonary vein isolation, VT, AV and RT, focal arrhythmias. We all use the same catheter. The market leader out there is the Smart Touch from Biosense Webster, and the fast follower is probably the TactiFlex catheter from Abbott, and then maybe 6% of the market of focal deflectables is all the other ones that may exist in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. And I thought to myself, if you're going to build a tool that would be transformative in the ventricle, I don't want to train doctors how to do new things. I want them to use the techniques that they're comfortable with, using with all the features that they're used to using, like contact force, magnetic navigation. I don't want to change any of that. All I want to change is their ability to reach. Using that tool, can I expand the capabilities? And so we decided to take we reverse engineered the electric fields that we wanted to create to allow, if electroporation was going to work, if pulse field was going to work, this is the kind of electric field I want. I want a symmetric field. I want to be able to reach 1.5 centimeters. I want to be able to make it small and discrete when I have little areas I want to get, so I don't have collateral injury. And we did finite element modeling and reverse engineered what does the electrode configuration need to look like in order to do that, and how do we optimize the pulse patterns or whatever we're doing to be able to make the workflow efficient and safe. And that's how Field Medical was born, because we just reverse engineered the ideal field for a focal catheter. What are we trying? We know that VT is an unmet need. There's about 6 million people in the world, or in the US and Europe right now, that have ventricular arrhythmias that could be treated with catheter ablation. These are premature ventricular contractions that are frequent enough, either causing a lot of symptoms or potentially putting people at risk of developing heart failure. Non-sustained VTs, of course, there's that category of patients that is quite large that could be treated with catheter ablation, but are currently being treated really ineffectively with drugs. So it's a large population. But then the people who have deadly arrhythmias, I mean, there's about 200,000 ICDs implanted in the US and Europe annually. And about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of those have events that that you could prevent, and potentially with the proper, if you can identify the source of the short circuit in the ventricle, you can actually cure their problems. And so these are pretty big groups of people that currently get treated with medications and a defibrillator that you could potentially just treat with a single procedure or 1 or 2 procedures with catheter ablation, and then they don't need those drugs, which are very toxic. And since it's such a well-recognized unmet need, people think the AFib market is gigantic and it's growing and it's proven. And so everyone's excited about atrial fibrillation. But the reality is the ventricular arrhythmia ablation space is quite large, and it's a blue ocean. And so, if right now there's maybe 1 million catheter ablation procedures performed annually in the world, but 10% of them are in the ventricle, and those it could be a highly competitive space, and it's definitely a space that the current tools don't work well in. And so as an entrepreneur, I see that as opportunity.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're taking these catheter technologies, the focal catheter that already exists today, and you're optimizing it. You're finding ways to create a generator and programming that catheter to deliver energy and those electric fields in a very specific, proprietary manner.
Yeah. We have the ability. I mean, what we learned to do really well here was to build the right type of electric field to achieve the ends. The ends for me are make a procedure that a doctor can do reproducibly, that has a very, like right now the average VT ablation is 4 hours long. Sometimes they go 7 hours long. And having sick people under anesthesia for those periods of time is very problematic. And a lot of the complications and the failures of catheter ablation for ventricular arrhythmias comes from long procedure times. And so we want to make the procedure reproducible and fast. and equally as effective as it currently is, but potentially more effective than it has been. And so like we're focused on those endpoints, and the tool that we're making just is a tool that naturally falls into that, because what is it that the doctor needs to be able to achieve? A 1 to 2 hour VT ablation, or reproducibly be able to get PVCs in sub 1 hour. A lot of that procedure time I have no control over, which is the part of the procedure where the doctor identifies where the problem is with the mapping system, and then getting the catheter to the site. But I can really control, part of that navigating part by building a good tool that works in the ventricle, but more importantly, providing them the energy source that very efficiently takes out the bad tissue, leaving all the other good tissue alive and well.
So you've got this huge unmet need, a blue ocean that's growing, not just an ocean already, but, a growing one. And clearly with your approach, I think there's this opportunity with a strong health economics argument to really improve the current standard of care. Question is, where are you now on this journey? Because this is so exciting, and it seems like you've done a lot already to get to where you are.
Company's 2 years old. We've been deeply involved in the kind of R&D first in man product development phase for 18 months. Our goal was, what's the fastest way to get all the features into a testable system? So I brought in some key talent, a lot of people. Now that I've been doing this for years and years, I know a lot of people, and that was really helpful in getting the right talent together. And so in that 18-month period, we were able to go from concepts to a tested system that's an R&D system, and tested in humans. So we've enrolled 15 patients in our first pilot study in Europe, and actually a total of 20, because we have 2 protocols, one for the ventricle. And we are doing a few in the atria as well. So we have an atrial protocol, because a tiny catheter like this, people don't think of it as having a large footprint because it's such a tiny catheter, but turns out that you can turn it up and you have a giant footprint, and it's incredibly fast at doing pulmonary vein isolation. I mean, I've done it now that FARAPULSE is on the market. When I do AFib ablation, I use FARAPULSE, and I feel pretty proud about it. I love the technology. But so the field is just as fast as FARAPULSE. And so, but it's a tiny little focal catheter that has all the versatility of like a smart touch. And so we wanted to be able to demonstrate that in a small group of people, but the focus of the real innovation of the company comes in the ventricle, and that's the first 15 patients. So that first phase of the company, it took us 18 months to get from concept to kind of proof of concept in patients. The preliminary data looks pretty good so far. But the whole personality of a startup like this changes after that first in-man phase. You move away from, guerrilla engineering, gonzo engineering, where you're just building the minimum viable prototypes that will work in a proof of feasibility kind of study, into a refined, structured organization for building a commercial product that has, there's so many more considerations: ergonomics, usability, robustness of the system, feature validation, and just the engineering, the level of engineering, the quality system, design history files, everything that you need just are substantially higher bar.
Yeah, and clearly you've got the track record and the knowledge, the experience, and of course the connections you touched upon there. And I can imagine people are equally excited, just as you are, about the potential for this. What's those conversations been like with other physicians?
Well, my doctor friends are very excited. We have, it's really fun to be a practicing doctor and be able to sit down and talk to my colleagues and respected physicians around the world that we have an opportunity to really influence the future of our field by participating in the entrepreneurial side of it. Like now are these the features you really want? Let's find a way to get them, and we can design it for you. you know, and it's really, I know that every company does that to some degree, but it's fun for me personally to be involved in that conversation and you know, and have that connection of being a practicing physician, also working so hard to transform. It's hard to raise. You know, the average class 3 device is around $94 million to get it over the finish line. So, you know, it takes a huge team of people and faith in investors and lots of stuff. So it's not one person who does any of this, you know. And so it's great to be a kind of a conduit for the opinions and the insights of the physicians. And we've had so many physicians invest in the company, and the excitement has been really palpable.
You know, you mentioned the class 3 there, and I think
Yeah.
it's interesting because I would have, you know, I guess I don't know nearly as much as you, but a lot of the catheters that I'm familiar with are more class 2. So, you know, why class 3? What's kind
Well,
of
you're in the heart and you're killing heart tissue. Heart tissue doesn't recuperate. And once it's dead forever.
okay?
So the FDA, and I agree with them 100%, you know, considers any catheter ablation tool to be a class 3 device, which is, it has potential for causing significant harm to the patient,
Sure.
and, you know, should be treated very carefully. And all the data that we're using, there's just a higher bar of data you need. And so, yeah, it's a hard field to work in. Class 3 medical devices, definitely, you know, there's a lot of easier ways to make a living.
Well, what about that FDA kind of pathway? Is this a 510K pathway?
Not at all. This is a PMA for sure. You know, there are applications 510K for soft tissue ablation with pulse fields outside the cardiac space. But you know, and just like radio frequency, it can be used for electrocautery surgically, but not necessarily in the heart. So there are some, you know, things that don't make sense when to most people, but collectively, you know, it's, again, the assessment of whether it's a 510K clearance or an approval with a PMA comes down to the category of risk that everyone believes is associated with this type of technology. So, you know, there are a couple other devices out there, you know, valves are considered class 3. You know, you could really mess up if you don't do a lot of, you know, work on engineering and proving out that your stent deployable valve is going to deploy and actually help the patient. People want to know that before you start selling it. You know, so that they don't have to be electrosurgical necessarily to be class 3, but it's really it's an assessment of whether or not these products pose significant harm to the patient if they were not to work well. And whereas, you know, let's say you had a radio frequency, you know, a crossing guide wire, that's a 510K clearance, you know, and yet you're still doing sort of ablation in the heart a little bit, but that's actually considered pretty safe given given the history of the field and what they're used for. So a company like Atriverse would definitely be, it doesn't have the same level of proof required prior to entering the market, clear, and so hence 510K.
Sure, sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, so because the PMA side, clearly this isn't being done today. There is no pulse field ablation being done on the VT side, right? So that would
Yeah,
be,
that, not with an IFU, not with the indication for it.
yeah, okay.
People, I know a few holdouts from the DC ablation era. You know, Steve Bayless at the University of Iowa occasionally brings out old Sparky and fires it off in desperate cases. You know, where he knows it'll help the patient. You know, and so that technology was never put through a PMA tech, but you don't have to as a doctor. So another thing that people may not realize is doctors don't have to follow the indications for the product. They can use a product any way they think will help the patient. There's so many drugs that are given for indications that they never ran a trial for. but there's still data, or there's some theoretical reasons why you might use it. Same with devices, catheter ablation was never really associated with a particular arrhythmia in the past. It was considered a soft tissue ablation tool. But at some point in the early 90s, the FDA started requiring that we run trials for a specific indication, saying this treats atrial flutter. And so now you've put all that investment into a clinical trial, and your indication for use says, I treat atrial flutter, and here's the data to prove it. And I don't kill people when I do it, and here's the data to prove it. And I can put that and market it and say, we are a flutter ablation technology. But guess what? People just, even though those were the first indications for catheters, a lot of catheters are sold that don't have indications for AFib, but it's the same catheter. And so we use a lot of stuff that's not, doctors are allowed to do that, but companies very clearly cannot advertise anything that's not in their indication. And so that's where it gets a little murky.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it's an expensive process to get this to market. I mean, in terms of timeline, like, how long would you hope, best case scenario, before you could see this on the market?
So field medical, of course, we're looking at it maybe an 18 to 24 month cycle from here to start our PMA. The PMA trial is going to be called Veritas. We're already designing it. The pilot studies we're doing right now are fully designed just to inform us on whether we're going to be choosing the right number of sites, whether our endpoints are viable endpoints. So we can do power calculations. How many patients do we need to enroll? We're doing a lot of that kind of footwork right now. But when it comes to running the PMA, the earliest that we could get the data done and then cycled through, you probably won't see a FDA approval of this product until the end of 2027, beginning of 28.
And Kyle, obviously looking ahead, I'm thinking about the opportunities to collaborate, because it sounds like this is built on a lot of existing technology. And so as much as you're building your own unique product, I'm thinking about who else you could be partnering up with in future as well.
Oh,
Is that something
well,
you
yeah.
see on the
So,
horizon?
we've had some success with partnering a little bit. We've partnering different degrees. There's a lot of you can't perform catheter ablation with just with the ablation tool itself, the field medical, field flex sheath, and field force ablation catheter, right? Like, I can't just I need an X-ray machine. I need a doctor. I need access. I need a mapping system. And in particular, we need mapping systems. So we've already partnered with CardioNext a little bit, and they've integrated our catheter, and we've used it with them, mostly to get experience with, what features do we need to optimize in order to be viable, not only for CardioNext, but for Carto and for Enside X and for arrhythmia, and these mapping systems. At some point, a company like this gets acquired, 90% of the time when it's a success, it's going to get acquired by one of 4 big medtech companies in the space, which is going to be Johnson & Johnson, Abbott, Medtronic, or Boston Scientific. And because of that, because they all have mapping systems, there's a lot of reason to want to partner with one of them early as possible to integrate our magnetic sensor and programming and everything, so the contact force can be seen on the display for the doctor. CardioNext was the first people that we worked with to do that, which has been an incredible, a learning for them and for us. And I'm a big fan of that. And so I could see us partnering with anyone with a mapping system. But one of the limitations, of course, is all the people who have mapping systems are also potential competitors. Not in the case of CardioNext, but in the case of a mapping system, of a holistic solution for catheter ablation, i.e., Johnson & Johnson, Abbott, Medtronic, and Boston Scientific all sell the entire kind of catalog of tools that you need in order for a doctor to do the procedure. And so, and since Boston Scientific currently has FARAPULSE, everyone's competing with Boston Scientific's current transformation of the market. It is a very successful rollout. They've done a great job. In the last, since being approved in the United States, they've increased the enterprise value of Boston Scientific $27 billion. And that is largely attributed to FARAPULSE.
Mhm.
And, if you look at the acquisition price of that company, it was a steal. Oh my God. And but not every technology performs that well, but that one did. And so you see all these companies out there, when we look to partner, we want to partner with them all, but eventually someone's going to buy it. And so they also have to think about that. And so partnering with other people, we have partnered deeply with our catheter developers. They're friends of the company, and and I've known them for over a decade as well. And so we've been able to move very fast on developing a very complex technology by building a pretty simple to build catheter.
That's huge. Simplicity is key, right? And I think, though, when it comes to mapping, and a lot of things that I've seen over the last couple years are these catheters that are coming out now that have the ability to do, the mapping and that ablation kind of all in one. Is that a direction that you're looking to go, or do you still want to be using, the fluoroscopy or other types of mapping capabilities that are kind of external and separate than catheter?
I think the first successful tool to do that is Affera. The Affera workflow is wonderful. Everyone loves it. I love it. They're a competitor. I pay a lot of attention to that. And there's some pros there. Now, it's not a high density mapping tool, but it's a mapping tool that kind of gets you where you need to go. It's the minimum viable mapping tool. It's interesting, though, in my mind, when I look at all the investment into high density mapping, things like HD grid, things like the Octaray, from the leaders in the field right now, and even arrhythmia's system really creates super dense maps of the activation patterns in the chamber that really give it an enormous amount of information that we're just beginning to learn how to use. And so when I hear you talk about an integrated mapping and ablation tool, if you ultimately, what the doctor needs is a tool that works and it makes it easier for them, less exchanges, less cost, whatever you want to say is your value proposition. Right now, I see the world kind of divided. There's a lot of bread and butter procedures you can do with minimum amount of mapping. You don't need these high density maps. And so empiric procedures, that might be the way to go. But for very but there's some growing data that these high density maps actually give us information that we can act on. And if that's the case, then you probably want to have two separate catheters. One that's optimized to be a great ablation tool, and one that's optimized to be an amazing mapping tool. And so I don't think that the market has spoken on which form factor is going to win in the end. I mean, the Affera technology is cool as hell. Would love it. But in the end, if I am using Affera and I need to get a high density mapping catheter as well, I don't know. It's then the value there of having all that complexity to the catheter doesn't help me much.
Yeah, well, this is the luxury of having electrophysiologists on the show, right? Because these are the insights that I think a lot of us have on the manufacturing side of the industry, where we're not, as in touch with these doctors and understanding how they're using these technologies and really the pros and cons of each, depending on the application. So it's really neat, because I thought for sure, like, oh wow, the combination of the two, that's a future, but and it very well
it could be. I'm not saying it's not.
Yeah, no, you're right, it could be, but I mean, it's really cool though to hear that, like, hey, there's a difference between some cases mapping isn't as important or it's not as needed, right? as other cases. And then if you do need a sophisticated mapping, well, it might be better off to have another catheter. I'm just also curious too, what about the like, so someone like Philips, right? They've got they're big on image guided therapies, right? They're
Yeah.
really trying to innovate in that space. They don't really have, I don't think, kind of this, ablation catheter technology that would, you know, be used. They don't have that in their suite of offerings. Do you see
Yeah.
like even someone like a Philips, like are they someone that kind
Well,
of could?
Philips put a bet into EP space and then they pulled out.
Okay.
So, and I think that they pulled out prematurely. They had a mapping system. They were looking to build out their portfolio. And then they realized that they had a lot of work to do to get their mapping system up and running well, and that the cost to play was maybe higher than they wanted to invest at the time. So they divested from their mapping system, and they shut down their EP division briefly. Now that said, there are a number of companies out there. GE, we know, is dabbling. They have their own EP division, which is the Pruka, recording system, and they could very well start acquiring technologies to get the full suite to compete. I've heard rumors of Siemens. I've heard rumors of Edwards. So some of the the big four, we all know who they are. Even Biotronic, so I was working with Acuitas, as you may know, I spent 3 years in senior leadership at Acuitas, but and know a lot about the challenges of having a mapping system without having an ablation tool, and vice versa. And so, when I look at a Philips and where they are, I think they divested prematurely, and they should have doubled down instead of pulling out. But I'm hoping that and after they get through the financial challenges that Philips is facing today, that they will jump back into the game.
Cool. Wow. Great insights there.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Maybe the timing again will align with your horizon. We'll have to wait and see. But I'm just so excited by all the things you've shared today. But one thing you mentioned, though, I'd love as we kind of finish off and think about reflection is, you mentioned being a high school dropout, which to me blows my mind because you've been just so like inspirational through everything you've shared today. But again, if you had any advice to give anyone who's thinking about getting into the industry or thinking about doing something entrepreneurial, given all your experience, what sort of tips would you want to share?
Well, I thought about it a little bit because we chatted before the recording. I talked to up and coming energetic people who want to be entrepreneurs, and there are so many doctors who want to be entrepreneurs, because they're constantly being faced with challenges, and they have very bright creative minds, and so they're solving the challenges in many ways, but they don't have the resources, time, or experience, know how to get it over the finish line, or what's really involved from point A to point B. But so I talked to a lot of people about this, and one of the things I like to tell people is really pick a true unmet need. Identify something that really is an itch that needs to get scratched, and you have to be sort of a content expert to understand the context of that unmet need to some degree. Now that might mean that you're like a video game kid. You're 14 years old and you just realize that, boy, wouldn't it be cool if I had a video game like this? It's an unmet need for me. Maybe it's an unmet need for somebody else. It doesn't have to be super fancy. Some of the best medical device plays that I've ever seen are really simple. Having disposable sterilized caps to place on the top of stopcocks. Like, wow, what a simple little plastic injectable thing that's sterile. And I can just, every time I take one off, I put in a brand new one that's sterile again. That's a great unmet need you didn't even know existed until it kind of got created there. But infections are an unmet need. And so finding that unmet need is the hardest part, I think, and really be knowing enough about the context in the market and why that unmet need is a real one. That's a thing that I make people meditate on. The other thing is, everyone's going to give an unexperienced entrepreneur the same advice. They're going to say, every startup takes twice as long. Every technology, it takes twice as long to develop, and it costs twice as much. And so, when you're there trying to write your budget, they give you that advice. And I like to go push back, and I say, every, the only companies I know that, like, every startup can get a product to the market for a quarter of the price and in a quarter of the time than any established multinational company. And so, the funny thing about startups is that there's an innate efficiency there that we shouldn't ignore. And yeah, you may not know there are a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of times you have to pivot and you have to reassess what you're doing. And that's what makes a great entrepreneur, is somebody who's willing to do that. But the reason we have so many successful startups, despite the fact that it's going to cost twice as much, and despite the fact that it's going to take twice as long, as your founder entrepreneur might estimate in their business plan, the reality is there's still a lot of margin if you get it right. I don't know. That's
Awesome.
probably the two things I like to tell people.
No, that is huge. I mean, I love that part about the crossover, particularly when you look at the gaming industry and how many people can think about whether it's augmented reality, virtual reality, or gamification. There's just so many opportunities for people who maybe aren't playing directly right now in the medical space, and they can get involved. So this is awesome advice.
True.
Yeah, and you know what? You've got a lot coming up, Stephen. I know you've got some clinical studies, some results coming out from your recent trip from Prague, and also you're traveling all over the world. But you've got the VT Symposium coming up in October, and then you've got HRS 2025.
Yeah, the company is really in a beautiful place right now. We've just de-risked it substantially. We had a big successful kind of seed fundraise that allowed us to get this far. We have a lot more fundraising to do, but the big events that we're going to do, that I'm looking forward to the most, are the VT Symposium in New York in October. Why? Because we're one of the very few people out there trying to pioneer better technology for ventricular tachycardia. And so we know we'll have a lot of great data to share, abstracts, and be able to meet with the world's experts in this area and get good feedback and insights into what's needed right now to transform the space. HRS are always a big event for everybody. The whole world of catheter ablation has been, drinking the AFib Kool-Aid for a decade, and I think they're looking for something that's not boring anymore. AFib is getting boring, which is a good thing. You're a success when your topic is starting to become common. Everyone has a PFA in the atria; they all know about it. What's the next big thing? And we're really poised with our pilot studies that are ongoing in Europe right now, to be able to share, finished, pilot studies, and the timing looks like we may have all three of them, in ready for presentation and publication by HRS, which is in April of 2025. And so, those are the two things I'm looking forward to the most. Of course, we're going to be at, fun, there's a lot of business stuff that I got to attend, like LSI, I'm going to, Life Science Intelligence meeting, which, has turned out to be much more productive for our company than I had originally thought. And so has been a valuable kind of meeting to go and interact with venture capital and fellow entrepreneurs in the space, and then it's a number of other meetings that are either in the AFib space or EP that I like to attend as a doctor, and less so as an entrepreneur.
Nice. Well, you got a lot of exciting things coming up. How do folks get in touch with you? What's the best way to contact you?
Well, of course, we have info at fieldmedical inc.com. And you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, of course. It's the only social media platform that I pay any attention to.
Good.
I know all my other EP doctor friends are all on Twitter, but or X now, I guess. But it's something that I just don't have time for.
Well, you got a busy
But-
schedule coming up, so I'm sure people can connect with you, all these events that you're going to be
Oh, yeah.
showing up at. And yeah, this has been incredible. So thank you so much. It's so exciting, as I mentioned at the beginning, to have one of the founding fathers of pulse field ablation on the show. So huge thank you to you, Stephen.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking your time and hanging out. And I know we'll cross paths at these meetings. Take care.
That's right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, another huge thank you to Dr. Stephen Mickelsen of Field Medical. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the MedTech Impact Podcast. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Mickelsen. Until next time, keep innovating.